This session, it's called Organizing Across Race and Class, and we can move to the next slide. So we want to start off by recognizing the Indigenous lands that we are all on today across the country. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we pledge to not replicate that history in our own movement for climate justice. Next slide. Some meeting norms we'd like to lift up today are, if you can, have your camera on, be kind to others, let's respect racial identities and pronouns today. A very important one in today's in specific is let's commit to learning to unlearn and self-transformation. Participation as much as possible. So we do have a lot of people here today and we're hoping to have some room for participation. Wish we had more. And step up, step back. So, speak up if you're not used to speaking up, but also step back to provide room for other people. So we can move to the next slide. We do also want to start off by just recognizing anti-racism work is not a box to check. So as we begin this introductory training on organizing across race and class, let's all keep in mind that working to dismantle systems of privilege and oppression are an ongoing process. And I'm sure you already know that, but we just want to lift that up today. So taking this training is an introduction, but the self-reflection and action that's required to dismantle oppression is a lifelong journey for each of us. Next slide. The facilitators today that I'd like to introduce you all to are Stephanie Bowman, staff here at Mothers Out Front, Troya Wright, an organizer here at Mothers Out Front, Elizabeth Credatis, who is actually a Mothers Out Front member and an organizer of the organization in Charles City County, Virginia, that we're lifting up as an example today, C5, and so is Barb Adams. And then I'm Sheila Keller. I'm the new manager of training here at Mothers Out Front. So nice to meet everybody today. We'll move to the next slide. A quick touching base on Mothers Out Front. Our mission is we build our power as mothers to ensure a livable climate for all children. Yay. Next slide. So we're in a series here, just to remind folks, we have a 4-part series, and the first one today, again, next slide. What you'll walk away with after this 4-part series is an understanding of why it's so important to organize across race and class, barriers to doing so, and an introduction for how to do it. Some tools to reaching out to large numbers of people to build your base of active volunteers across race and class. So those are canvassing, tabling, social media outreach, and reaching to centers of community. Then how to have a one-on-one conversation to recruit people and build relationships for a stronger movement. And finally, the importance and how-to of the group meeting to tap into already existing social networks in the community and to build your base, to build your power. Next slide. Today's agenda is welcome. Then we're going to delve into some really important topics to have for self-reflection, self-education before we even go out into any community to do any work. So talking about systemic racism and the environmental movement, white supremacy culture and how that pervades everything, including our organizing spaces, unfortunately. Transactional versus transformative organizing. And then we'll move into the bulk of today, what I'm really excited for, which is C5, the organization out of Charles City County that has done some really transformative organizing across race and class. And they're our sort of case study today. We'll hear their story, we'll debrief their presentation, go out into breakout groups for self-reflection about our own teams, and then come back together for a whole group reflection before we end for today. Next slide. So we're going to start off with a prompt today. How do you work to fight climate change most often? So look in your chat. We're going to drop into your chat a link to this slide deck. And along the edges, there are little icons. And we want you to drag and drop the icon where on this scale you feel like you best fit. Are you on the far left, super mom, me and my 2 best friends do it all? Or are you on the far right? We have a multi-generational, multiracial, economically diverse team of a large number of moms who work together like a mature ecosystem. So where are you along this spectrum? And if you have any difficulty, you can also just chat in and describe where you think you are on this spectrum. We'll give you like 30 seconds, 45 seconds to try and drag and drop your icons. And so I only see 4 icons on here. And in the interest of time, not worrying about technical difficulties, this will keep evolving, but let's just talk about this for a moment. Chat in, what are the difficulties with just going with the far left side? Me and my best friends do it all. Burn out, amen. I've been organizing for 20 years and I can definitely say that's the biggest one. So that's the main lesson. Frustration, not sustainable. Power comes in numbers. Actually, that's the main lesson. Sorry. We've got to build our power, right? And we can't get burnt out in the meantime, or we're going to lose people along the way, including ourselves. So let's go to the next slide. So this just brings it home. Why should we strive to build a strong group of mothers and others working together across differences? What do you see in this image here? Drop it in the chat. Probably all of you are familiar with this image. I also, like someone said, we lose out on ideas others can bring to a project. And this is a picture, Suzanne says, David beats Goliath. Yeah, so we need power in numbers to beat the fossil fuel industry. There's no other way around it. Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. So what is base building, which is the basis for this training series? It's the foundation of good organizing. We cannot organize without base building. It's the critical work of engaging the people most directly affected, and note that, most directly affected, in a campaign or organization, and developing their ability to collectively address issues they care about. Next slide. It's also the core strategy for building community power. So those people directly affected by the problems we're addressing, they become a part of our team and they make our base. A large base that we're constantly replenishing. And again, I'll say constantly replenishing. So this is the beginning of a campaign, but it's also throughout the entire way. That connects us back to the community. And sometimes, unfortunately, in organizing, that's a vital part of good organizing that we forget. We have to have a lifeline to the community so we know what their issues are, what they're experiencing, what will move people to action. Next slide. And at Mothers Out Front, we've coined something called ground truthing, which in a Venn diagram kind of overlaps with base building. Base building is a part of it, but it's just that idea again of going to the community, finding out who's on the front lines of our issues, determining who we want to build power with, who are our allies, what are the assets, what are the issues, what are the threats in the organization, and pulling that all together so that when we begin organizing, we have roots, we have a lifeline to the community, and they are leaders in our movement, and we're not starting until we have that. So next slide. So now we're going to move into systemic racism in the climate movement with Stephanie.
Hey y'all. So I know you're probably asking, well, what is the reason that we're talking about systemic racism? I just want to know about base building. And the reason behind it is because in order to ground truth, we have to unlearn our extractive tactics around organizing. And unfortunately, it's really normal for us. We're even unconscious to some of the tactics because that's what we've been taught, right? And so part of this is rooted in our bias, and it's also rooted in systemic racism. Next slide. So quick question. How many of you had a chance to read your one pager around systemic racism? This is a judge-free zone. Just put a 1 in the chat if you were able to read it. That just lets me know how deep I may need to go into things. Wonderful. Thank you all. This makes it much easier for me. Okay, let's jump in here. So it's important to keep in mind, y'all, that racism is a system. It is not an individual character flaw, nor a personal morale failing, nor a psychiatric illness. It is a system, and it consists of structures, policies, practices, and norms, right? And those structures or opportunity, and they assign value to certain people based on their phenotype or the way that they look. Next slide. So let's think of climate change as a tree. And if climate change was a tree, next slide, what would some of the fruits be? What would some of the outcomes be? And so I put some examples here for you. I know that many of us may be seeing wildfires that are occurring everywhere. Some of us are having bad air alerts. And I don't know about you, but the cost of a lot of fruit is going up. So next slide. Yes, exactly, Sarah. So when we think of those three examples, what are the branches? What are the things that allow these fruits to be nourished? So for the wildfires, some may say lack of forest maintenance. For wildfires, folks would say, what are some other examples of what are the branches? What are the things that consistently drought, extreme heat? There we go. Okay, what about poor air quality? What are some of the branches that allow pollution, burning fossil fuels, oil and gas production? Capitalism, flooding. Yes, some people are getting further. We're not at the roots, y'all. We at the branches. We're at the branches. Okay, next slide. So now let's talk about those roots. What are those systems? Someone shared one earlier. Capitalism, right? Next slide. Yes, so here is a way to kind of visualize it. At the root of this tree is colonialism, right? This extractive economy nature of going places and extracting its resources. It's capitalism rooted, right? At the bottom of this climate change tree. Patriarchy, you know, there's some audacity in the ability to pollute in certain communities, right? That is rooted in patriarchy. And then obviously white supremacy culture. The idea that certain communities were deemed okay if they were taken by people who were deemed more civilized, right? And so it's important to keep in mind that when you think about racism, because we're talking about systemic racism, it really is nothing more than prejudice and discrimination, right? And how it shows up and manifests in all these different ways. Next slide. So when we talk about structural and institutional racism, I'm a visual person, so for those of you that are visual learners, this is for you. These are kind of some of the institutions we know, right? So we know there's the legal institution. We have our homes, we have our education, we have our religion and our faith, we have our medical. And so when we think about how structural and institutional racism shows up, it's around the public policies, those practices, those cultural representations. So around the fossil fuels, it's around like leniency to certain polluters to be in certain zoned areas, right? Eminent domain, land sovereignty. And so these are just some examples of how it can show up. Next slide. So systemic racism, as is defined here, is a reinforcement of white supremacy built into all of our societal systems. So we talk about structural institutions as like, hey, these institutions may have policies that are harmful to all different people, right? Based on race, based on class, based on gender. But systemic racism is really focused on how white supremacy is built into all of our systems. And so the definition here to the left was first coined by Stokely Carmichael, picture below. And the definition of racism to the right, I just felt was very helpful to lift up Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. And it's around that it's a systemic structure and it functions in all areas of our society. And so this is still very similar, it's overlapping. Next slide. So we're like, okay, how does this relate to climate justice and environmental justice? So for those of you who shared one in the chat, Can you share what's the difference? What's the difference between climate justice and environmental justice? There's no, I mean, yeah, go ahead. There we go. So someone said environmental is more man-made. I wouldn't say so. I would see climate justice as a subset of environmental justice. Yes. Environmental justice is an overview. Okay. So no. Next slide. The simplest way to define the two is that climate justice is a term and it's a movement, and it acknowledges that climate change can have different effects on different people based on where they are, based on their population, based on different things. Environmental justice is the principle that all people deserve to have equal protection and equal enforcement. So one is really rooted in acknowledgement, like, hey, this is going on, this exists. It's a movement to bring acknowledgement, to get people to realize it exists. But environmental justice is like, hey, what can we do to fight these systems?
2 minutes left.
Thank you. Next slide. All right, next slide. So I'll just get to this. So when it gets to base building and why this matters is that there's different tactics in how we fight this tree, right? And so I'm making just 2 examples of 2 different women. We don't all have to use just these tactics. I could have someone burning the tree, so let's not get lost in the metaphor. But to the right, we have someone who's like, I'm digging up the root, right? I'm doing something radical. I want you to see me. I'm taking up space, right? Whereas we have the person to the left that is like, hey, my back is to the system. I'm going to make an easy win in the environment around me, right? I can plant a garden. I can surround my whole self with flowers and not see the tree, right? And often, sometimes in our organizing, we know that it can be easier to mobilize people around one or the other, right? And so question for those of you in the chat, which tactic do you think would be easier to build base? The radical at the front attacking the roots being seen, or the person who's like, hey, I want to build a garden that's around me and kind of just create the wins I can create?
1 minute.
Yes, Billy, Mary Kay, build a garden. And so often in our work, we feel torn between the two, right? Where we know we need to do these visible, these things that can build power, but we know those are really extractive in nature, right? Like they drain our volunteers, they drain our teams, whereas the garden is something that can be validating and gratifying. So we're out of time. And next slide. I'm passing it over for us to dive a little bit more into white supremacy culture, and I hope that was helpful, y'all.
Hey, everybody. I'm Barb Adams. Let's see, I'm from Richmond, Virginia, Mothers Out Front team. I have a couple of things to just share with you quickly. One is that I am not an expert on fighting white supremacy and racism. I see myself as someone who's been an ally and an advocate with communities around Virginia, and most currently with the concerned citizens of Charles City County. And most of these communities have been facing fossil fuel infrastructure and other polluting industries in their communities. 2 is that I see this work as being on a spectrum, and I am on that spectrum like everybody else. It's a personal journey, and as Sheila said, it's a lifelong journey. So I apologize for those of you that had know about these ideas and have already heard them before, and for those of you that this is new. So we're gonna try to all learn and move just another step in that journey, however it works for us. And in the interest of time, I'm going to use my notes so I can try to stick to that. I want to acknowledge that while not everyone here is white supremacy culture affects all of us. And white supremacy and privilege, unchecked and kept subliminal, is dangerous and harms many people and our society. White supremacy culture is primarily perpetuated by white people. In order to fight it, we first have to be conscious of it. White people in particular need to, one, become more aware of the issues caused by and causing this oppression. Two, do a lot of work to educate ourselves about oppressive systems. And three, grow in ways and places we actively work and fight to end it. So the overall goal is to work to dismantle white supremacy in all of its forms. Tonight, we're just going to learn a little bit more about white supremacy and white privilege and how it shows up in the culture that we live in, and also how we can work more consciously in our groups to try to end white supremacy in our circles. Next slide. Okay. When we are even thinking about doing work to dismantle oppressive systems that we are integrally tied to, we can experience a lot of anxious thoughts, a range of emotions, and mental blocks and resistance. Breathing is a good tool whenever we feel challenged by our own thoughts, racist and otherwise, and actions, and see and admit to our behavior. So let's just all together take a few deep breaths to ground ourselves in our bodies so we can stay present. Next slide. What we're asking for. Margaret, if there's a way if I can ask for a volunteer to raise their hand, can you pick a volunteer?
It is a little difficult for me to see people right
Okay.
now.
Okay. All right. Well, I was going to try to see if we could do that, but in this slide, I wanted to talk about what we're being asked. No one is asking you to apologize for being white. No one is asking you to apologize for the sins of your ancestors. What we are asking is that you help dismantle the oppressive systems they built, any that you still benefit from. When we're, let's see. So being white doesn't inherently make us bad. We are, most of us, not consciously in the world thinking that we're superior to people and other races. It's deeper and therefore more concerned than that. But being white does give us access to the system of white supremacy culture that we live in, that elevates and benefits white people with access to more privileges and in all sorts of ways that are often invisible. Take a deep breath. Next slide. I'm going to go ahead and read this, but white supremacy culture is a form of racism centered upon the belief that white people are superior to people of other racial backgrounds, and that whites should politically, economically, and socially dominate non-whites. Characteristics of white supremacy elevate the values, preferences, and experience of one racial group above others. Like racism, it is baked into the systems and institutions all around us, as Stephanie has shared some. So put into the chat, what are some of the ways that you have witnessed white supremacy in general in our culture? Policing, yeah. College admission process, yeah. Wealth, generational wealth, inheritance, redlining, voting restrictions. Yeah, these are all great. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Now, what are some of the ways that you see white supremacy culture acting in your immediate area, in your neighborhood, you know, within your family systems, in your really local community? Yeah, transportation and shopping. Yeah, often, obviously some of the same, but it's important to see that this is part of our everyday life. Thank you. Awesome. Golf course. So we don't have time to explore this more deeply, but if you're willing, please share some emotions or reactions you have in witnessing white supremacy in your life. Shame, repulsion, angry at injustice, fear, frustration, sorrow, sadness, yeah. Discouragement. I'm sorry, okay. Next slide. So white privilege is the set of advantages that are unearned, built-in accesses to power or immunities that white people benefit from on a daily basis beyond those common to all others. I know this is a term that often people hear about, but especially for those of us who identify as white, sometimes it's really hard for us to see exactly what our benefits are. In the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you all to put one thing in the chat that you feel like you have benefited from if you identify as white, or you identify as non-white if you see other people kind of in your sphere benefiting from, that we would identify as white privilege. Yes, thank you. So you all are really getting this. It's sometimes hard for those. So we feel like we haven't done anything, we haven't asked for that, and yet we still benefit from this. We didn't actively create the system, and yet we benefit from it. Next slide. So this is an illustration of some of the real differences between what we call overt and covert racism. So clearly, overt racism is something that we can all sort of identify in the outer culture. What we tend to see that as what those people do, not what we do. And somehow that's the kind of idea of overt racism that confuses people about the fact that we might all have racist feelings, and that some of these things are much more subliminal than we might want to admit. So I'm just going to pick a couple of these. And if you see one of the less, the covert, one of the less accepted or less recognized forms of racism in the lower part underneath the line, under the water, if you would just put that in the chat, what do you see as something that you can identify with, or that jumps out at you as either surprise or something you're familiar with?
1 minute, Barb.
Okay, thanks. So this idea that there are aspects of racism that we can really learn and become and spend more time really understanding for ourselves in this part of our area that's covert, less overt. Next slide. So quickly, some manifestations of white supremacy, white saviorism, when people just move in and assume that they understand without even asking what people need in communities. This is really important part of community and ground truthing. And working in communities that you are not a part of. White fragility is the discomfort and defensiveness on the part of white people when confronted by information about racial inequality. And what tends to happen is a switching of that and somehow making it about us and not about the discomfort that we're feeling around the racial issue that's come up. And tokenism is a practice of making, again, more of a perfunctory or a symbolic effort to have inclusion of folks that are different rather than a real understanding of the cultures that bring us together. Next slide. Some ways of organizing that help to fight white supremacy: listening more than talking. Some of these might be a surprise to you because they are, we identify some of these things as good organizational practices, like emphasizing how things are done over how much and what gets done. You know, we would think that, yeah, of course we want to do a lot, we want to get a lot done. But if that's more important than how people are treated or the process that we work together with, then that is part of a question for us, a big question in our organizational practices.
Time.
Okay, can I just go to the last, quickly, the last? Yeah, and these are some of the practices that we want to move away from, assuming we're all the same, that we don't have a history that impacts what we, that we bring to our organizing structures, that's top-down hierarchical, denying the reality of systemic racism, classism, and how it impacts all of our work together, and not analyzing those in our organizational processes. Thanks so much. And we move on to Troya.
For sure. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be talking about transformative organizing, and I know that was a lot. So definitely put a 1 in the chat to think Barb, and of course, Stephanie. Thank you guys so much, because that brings a lot to the conversation that we're going to have now. Of course, this is, like we said, not a checklist. This is not going and diving deeply into these subjects, but I think that we should definitely talk about transformative organizing versus transactional and power. Next slide, please. So hopefully it's easy to read, right? We have the types of power and how they appear. Before I go into those types, I think it's important to bring the subjects we talked about earlier, like systemic racism, white supremacy culture, white fragility, et cetera, right? Because a simple definition of racism is prejudice plus power. We don't know what power is yet, right? And I'm reminded of a quote from Stokely Carmichael, who said, "I'm not concerned with racists. I'm concerned with racists that have the power to harm me." What is power and how does it play into our work? So power, in a short definition, is the capacity, resources, people, and ideas for self-determination. Self-determination is our ability to define, create, sustain, and protect our collective destiny. In short, power is the ability to affect change. So no matter how racist someone is, if they don't have the power to do anything to you, it's not really going to matter, right? It might hurt your feelings, but you'll be able to move around the chessboard, as it were. So a very important thing that Sheila said earlier was that we can't beat the fossil fuel industry without strength in numbers. I put emphasis on industry because oftentimes when we're doing our work, we put emphasis on the people right next to us. We put pressure on ourselves. We put pressure on communities that oftentimes don't have the ability to affect change in the things that are going on around them, right? Single-use plastics, using gas in their homes. They can't change these things on their own. So that's why we build power. And I kind of gave away the answer, right? But there are three different types of power, usually. There's appeal to power. One example is asking politicians to see us as human, begging, showing them that we're just like them, appealing to their humanity is appealing to power. And then resisting power is almost acting as if the power that they have or the power that certain folks in our communities have don't affect us. I'm going to sit at this table no matter what. I'm going to do a sit-in here. I'm going to burn it down. We have riots, we have rallies, et cetera, right? And then building power is the one that should be most important to us as what we call grassroots organizers, bringing together or organizing people to change the balance of power as it exists, forcing politicians to give you what you want because it's in their best interest as well. We're talking about grassroots campaigns, we're talking about unions, we're talking about all of those things that bring people together to change that balance and ultimately change the system. So earlier, Stephanie talked about extractive tactics, right? Instead of digging up the roots that cause the issue, we get at building planting a new flower or taking off the fruit instead of getting at the cause, instead of getting at the symptoms instead of the cause, right? Instead of the disease. So this is a large part of transactional versus transformative organizing, and class usually dictates our typical positionality to the respects of the types of power and their efficacy. People that have a lot more power within their class range, right? If you are a wealthy person, your appeals to power work much more effectively because you're closer to those people. They respect you more because of either your class or your race, either or both, right? And so they all play into it. Next slide. So here we have a simple example of two folks that we know pretty well. We have organization, then we have mobilization. And in the chat, if you can give me an example of mobilization, it'd be really helpful while I'm explaining this. So we put Martin Luther King next to Malcolm X, not because they were on opposite ends of the spectrum. Both of them were very radical, but they had a couple different tactics. They say that when Malcolm X showed up to a city, he brought folks together He talked to them about the systemic issues. And then before he left, he created an organization. Oftentimes it was a mosque, but something was left there. So then when things started getting iffy in the community, there was already a system of people organized and ready to mobilize to stop whatever was coming their way. Martin Luther King, how many minutes?
4.
4 minutes, thank you. And Martin Luther King had a different strategy, right? He would show up to a place, we would have a march, we'd have a rally, we'd have a sit-in, we'd have a boycott, etc. We'd get the people riled up, and then he would leave on to the next city. There would be no system set up to change these structures. So grassroots organizing, as we talked about before, is bringing together people who have something in common, that have both personal and community consequences to grant themselves the authority to solve the problem. The desire at the end is to create system change. Mobilization is a temporary burst of political energy. It can move masses of people to show solidarity on the case of issues that fruit. In short, mobilization is spending your power. And together, mobilization and organizing can be used to create system change. You build power with organizing, and then you spend that power to get to the next step and build more capacity. To be an organizer, you must be a mobilizer, but to be a mobilizer doesn't make you an organizer. Next slide, please. So we have a couple different ideas, right? So transformative organizing recruits masses of people to fight militantly for immediate concrete demands that have to be won, but always as a part of a larger strategy to change structural conditions in the world, getting at the root. Transactional organizing asks people to change themselves or tells them that change comes from a single source of reform, using people for organizational gain or popularity, planting a flower, as Stephanie was talking about before, right? I'm sure we can think of some examples in the chat of things that are transactional versus transformative. And if we move to the next slide and we get a link in the chat where we can move our cursors over again, we can choose a image, right, to slide on the scale. How do you fight in the climate change movement, right? How do you fight in this environmental justice ideology that we're trying to live through with your campaigns in your area? Just take one and place it on that continuum, right? The tactics and the campaigns that you sort of work with. So could you refresh and show us our results? Oh yeah, we have a lot of transformative stuff and some transactional. And we'll be getting a little bit into C5 next, so we can figure out what did a transformative movement look like and what systems were left afterwards to ensure that we're getting at the root.
So I think the next slide. Yay, okay. Well, so this is Beth Cordatis, and I have the privilege to introduce Cynthia Robinson, Lavisha Rollins, and Wanda Roberts. These are 3 of the many wonderful core members, the founders of C5. And I'm going to turn it over, next slide, to Wanda Roberts, who's going to tell us a little bit about Charles City County and the movement they started there.
Charles City adopted the slogan 4 centuries, 3 cultures, 2 rivers in 1 county as a part of the commemoration of America's 400th anniversary. Charles City is situated southeast of Richmond and west of Jamestown. It is bounded on the south by the James River and on the east by the Chickahominy River. The estimated population is 6,900, and there are approximately 2,300 homes. The 3 cultures are African American, approximately 49%, white, 40%, and Native American, 7%. The county is painted as a reflection of America's past and land lost in time. Next slide. In 1990, a mega landfill was built in Charles City County. The enormous amount of air, water, and soil pollution has resulted in many health issues, including cancer clusters. The intense, noxious odor makes it near impossible to be outside on many days. Today, we face the expansion of this mega landfill, another example of why it is so important to keep the community, the community informed and engaged. Next slide. C5's campaigns started with the intention of stopping the C4GT and the Chickahominy power plants from being built in Charles City County. The demographics and the day-to-day struggles for the residents made a perfect storm for environmental racism. Race is often a more reliable indicator of proximity to pollution. The disproportionate burden of environmental hazards placed on people of color creates sacrifice zones for the wealthy environmental polluters. The residents and the community pay the price for their health, impacts to air, water, and soil, economic development, and so much more. It was time to stand up together for the same goal. We are fighting today for a better tomorrow for generations to come. Not race, age, or class would divide us. Collectively, our goal to stop the C4GT and the Chickahominy Power Plant came first. On July the 11th, 2021, the developer of the C4GT power plant announced they were no longer pursuing this project. Our community won this battle. However, we continue to fight the battle to stop the Chickahominy power plant. It would also bring the burden of our water supply, withdrawal of 30 million gallons from the Potomac Aquifer annually. Another issue would be the enormous amount of wastewater being sent to the Roxbury wastewater treatment plant. This treatment plant is not equipped to handle the toxic chemicals from the Chickahominy power plant. Next slide.
1 minute.
The DEQ permitted emission chart shows the cumulative risk amounts of pollution that would be released into our air, water, and soil. You will note that this chart also includes the existing Ingenco plant, a utility using landfill gas for electricity. It does not include the many other ways the mega landfill pollutes our water, air, and soil. Next slide. Today, we are fighting yet another pipeline, the Chickahominy Pipeline. It is proposed to run through 5 Virginia counties, Louisa, Hanover, Henrico, New Kent, and ending up in Charles City County to feed the proposed Chickahominy Power Plant. There is no need or necessity for this power plant or the pipeline for the state of Virginia. Next slide.
Oh, sorry, Wanda, I don't mean to cut you off. So this is Beth again. So Wanda is really speaking as one of the core members of C5, which is the Charles City County grassroots organization that started in June of 2019. I'm here to speak more as a member of Mothers Out Front. I'm a member of the Richmond Mothers Out Front team. And I had just joined Mothers Out Front in the winter of 2019. And in that winter and in the early spring, a handful of us on the Richmond Mothers Out Front team learned about Chickahominy Power, which is one of the 2 gas plants that Wanda's been describing. For me, this was going to be my first campaign with Mothers Out Front. And for me, it was very much a whirlwind of learning about everything related to gas plants, permitting, and organizing all at once. It was a whirlwind. And it was really true for the team as a whole. Well, some of us were pros like Barb, but for me, it was very much new work. So in the winter of 2019, we did a lot of things, like we submitted a lot of comments, asked our friends and neighbors to submit comments, but I'm assuming you all can see me. I'm a white woman. My friends and neighbors tended to be white women. And I live in Henrico County. I don't live in Charles City County. So we only got about 110 comments submitted. It was enough to get the gas plant elevated to the DEQ. But we were realizing, probably belatedly, that we really needed to engage and communicate with Charles City County residents. And so at that point, we actually started doing organizing in earnest. We started to try to reach out to Charles City County, because none of us were from Charles City County. We started to try to find residents by starting with churches. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a Google spreadsheet that we created. We basically used Google Maps to search for churches in Charles City County and figured out how far those churches were from the gas plant. And then on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a little handmade information sheet that we sent to the pastors of those churches, inviting them to an information session. Barb and some other allies in the Sierra Club canvassed and went door to door. We were also cold calling people at random. Like I was Googling the science teachers at the Charles City County High School and sending them emails. Wanda got a call from someone at the Sierra Club that for a long time she thought was me. But basically, we were able to get 35 people to come to the information session that we held at the Charles City County Library. We did not come with a presentation or an intention to come in and tell folks like, this is what you should do. And, this is what, these are the actions you need to take. But we just wanted to make sure residents in the county were aware of the gas plant. And we discovered very quickly that particularly African-Americans in the county had received no information about these gas plants, even though they were, the Chickahominy gas plant would have been the 5th largest, possibly the 5th largest in the country. So it's a big deal, but people weren't informed. At that point, we encouraged folks to attend the DEQ Air Board hearing, and they did. Unfortunately, the DEQ refused to allow residents from the county to even participate in that event, and they quickly approved the plant. Mothers Out Front's role at this moment was really kind of to step back. And within a week, the people who had been at that information session, the Charles City County residents, largely who had come from one of the churches that you see listed here, Cedar Grove Baptist Church, a historically African-American church in Charles City. They decided to form an organization known as C5. And from that point on, C5 has, Mothers Out Front has played a support role for, I might have said that wrong. Mothers Out Front has played a support role for C5. If you would go to the next slide. Thank you. So just to wrap up my portion of this, Mothers Out Front did a lot of what you would consider to be base building in Charles City County. So the canvassing that we've done, the letters and the calls to pastors and residents, holding that information session, but then treating the information session as a community-based space for conversation. We certainly also did social media messages, and in a few minutes, Cynthia is going to tell you about the newsletter that we created, or that C5 really led. All of this was intended to try and build trust in the community, in their own organization that we were supporting. So if you go to the next slide, I think it's Cynthia speaking about all of the other examples of strategies that the base building strategies that C5 took the lead on at that point. So
hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Robinson. I'm a core member of C5. As you can see, we had a sign put out, protect our air and water, no gas plants. We made the yard signs, we put them up throughout the county. We collected hundreds of petition signatures. The signs helped us to achieve accountability throughout the community and give them information on how to reach C5 if they were interested. The signatures that we collected, we did it in one day. So we went to they went to the DEQ meeting that day after we had the meeting at the library, and other organizations and some citizens of Charles City also went for that meeting. Next slide. Okay, excuse me. We hosted comment writing events at libraries and churches, which you can see that we did 3 of them at Charles City. I know we did one in Henrico, we did one at the high school also. So we had events with the DEQ, which is the Department of Environmental Quality, for informational session about the water permit for the gas plant, or one of the gas plants. Several citizens attended, and there was a lot of questions asked. We had a comment writing period at Cedar Grove. It's one of the biggest. I'm sorry, I did that. Excuse me. It was one of the biggest comment writing periods that we had, because we collected emails, phone numbers, addresses, and over 100 people attended. So that turned out very well. Next slide. Okay, so we host events like the Facts and Food Forum at Cedar Grove Baptist Church. We held the Fact Forum at Cedar Grove Baptist Church, detailing information on the costs and effects of having a power plant in the county. We had several guest speakers. Some were environmentalists. They were able to demonstrate the adverse effects of having the power plants. This led to further questions and concerns from some of our county residents. This also enabled C5 to obtain scientific information as documentation that has been vetted by the several individuals, whom of which are experts in this field of study. Next slide. So we, okay, let me read first. C5 has created several avenues of communication for the public. Initially, we went to different churches to talk to the people in the churches, to try to get them information, to see if they were interested, to try to come on board with C5. And we went to, and then, excuse me. So this is how we became aware that most residents in the county were not aware of the plants. A lot of them didn't know. So the county didn't do a good communication to the people in the county. And within our collective efforts, we decided to create a Facebook page, a website. It has several forums, as well as sending out the 2,300 mailers to the citizens of the county. With all of these methods, we were able to reach out to many residents. And a lot of the residents did reach out to us to let us know that they thought we were doing a good job and they were thankful for us. Next slide. So this is the one of us engaging with the community. It's outreach by supporting 2 Easter Sunday celebrations with food donations and village parade float for Charles City residents. We did praise in the parking lot, and it was a lot of fun. So this is one of the ways of engaging the citizens of Charles City by donating Easter baskets. We also had Chick-fil-A cards, Visa cards. We had the meal donation. And we were just trying to show the community that we were there for them, that we are trying to engage them into what was going on around the county and let them know that we always be there for them. Thank you.
So I'm my name is Lavisha Rollins, with one of the members of C5. And so we did a lot of work in the community. When we first got started, we didn't know what to do. Like I said, Wanda explained that we got together for one common purpose, and that was to take down these power plants that were coming into our community. So with all of our work, we had to, hit the ground running. In the country, you don't have your next door neighbor within walking distance typically. You're literally, a quarter of a mile or half a mile from each other. So walking is not an option when you're actually going door to door. It's getting in your car and going knocking on doors. So with all our efforts, we got some wins that helped to keep our momentum and to keep our spirits high. So we defeated, with the help of organizations like Mothers Out Front, the Save, the HIP, Sierra Club, Virginia Interfaith Delight. It's a number of our sister organizations, AMD Pine Grove, sorry. So the 24-mile hotline, which would have 3 new compressor stations, defeated, meaning it is not coming. The STC removed it from the docket, so we were able to work with that and get that canceled. So that's one of our victories. Next slide. The next thing was C4GT came crumbling down. Our power, one of our county administrators advised us that our efforts was actually, not our administrator, one of the administration people, I would say, made a comment when we organized that they wouldn't be around longer than a year and that they would just go away. Well, we're proud to say with the help of Patrick Wilson, C4GT is gone. So now we are down to 1 power plant. So this shows you the actual date, July 11th, that we were notified, and so the citizens of the state of Virginia. Next slide. But with all our wins, the fight continues. It never stops. So we're now having the Chickahominy pipeline that's coming, which Wanda showed you a visual and explained how that's going to impact not only Charles City, but other counties that are going to be interconnected with this pipeline. And the Chickahominy power plant is still alive and going. They are pushing forward with that plant. It will be the 5th largest in the United States of America. And it is, if you go back and look at our emissions chart later, you will see the amount of emissions that we're facing with Charles City, and also that it's literally within a mile of our mega landfill, and that there are current residents that their property abuts right up to the plant. So it'll be basically a fog around residents, and it's predominantly people of color. And the mega landfill is expanding. We're now at about 300 acres currently, and it's expanding up to 1,800. So this landfill is looking to expand its sales so that it can take in more trash. But C5, as we have shown, we don't give up easily. So these will not be projects that will be coming in while we idly stand by. So this will be something that we look to report soon as another defeat. Next slide. Lessons learned. I do not want to make it sound like these feats were easy. They were not. Each person in our role plays a unique part, and we support one another. I have to make sure that everyone understands that everyone in C5 does something. We learned early on that we could not do it all by ourselves. We had to reach out to other organizations to help them, and they help us because we can't do this. It's too much work and research that had to be done. So we built two-way relationships and trust in our community. We are very transparent. If the community has a concern, they can come to us, whether it's seeing one of us in person, reaching out to us on Facebook, that is something that we allow them to do. And we actually talk to them and figure out how we can help them. I can't guarantee that every time they reach out to us, we're successful, but we do make an attempt. People who live in the county get a vote, those outside do not. We basically want the community. One of the things with rural communities, minority communities, is a lack of trust. So they'll always call people that are not from the county or live in the county as people who are making decisions that don't impact them. So we kind of made the rule that, hey, it has to be us making the decisions who are actually either living, working, or have a family member interconnected to make decisions that are based in Charles City. As they said, divide and conquer. You got to find your common enemy and fight for that purpose. So what happened was,
1 minute.
What we just learned was that, okay, we all don't want these power plants. We don't like what's going on. It's time to go. We realized that we all have strengths and weaknesses, and our strengths are our weaknesses are our strengths. I may be good at something where one of my members is not, but if they're good at something, they balance out my weaknesses. And that's how you make sure that your group has no weaknesses, because the other person's strength covers that. Acknowledge the problems that you have in your group. C5 is not without any internal problem, but we acknowledge it and face it head on. Failure is going to happen. Learn from it, move on. Don't fester over it, just keep it moving. Next slide. Be honest and open with one another. Don't cover it up. Just say what you got to say and let it go. Communicate in various methods with the community. You have to let them know what's going on at all times. Even if you don't like what you're about to put out, being transparent will give you more credibility than not. We held meetings in convenient places so that people could reach us and not have to go long distances. So we made sure we were always accessible. We built community relationships with churches and members and things like that to kind of also bring people in. In the community, they want you to reach out to them and actually feel where they're coming from. So that takes a lot of time. And environmental cannot be your only concern, because you'll lose a lot of people. You have to address all of the concerns when you're trying to get them to relate to you. Next slide. One of the things at C5 you will see with us, we are multidimensional, different races, very diverse, but we discuss race and we face it personally and head on. You have to discuss race. I'll use an example. We were at a county administration meeting, and a gentleman approached me, and he was a white male. And there was a white male that stepped in front of me and said, "She can't say it, but I can." And he realized that where I was, what was happening, it was best if he took the hit. you have to recognize those things and you have to deal with them. And we talked about it after the meeting, and we were able to come together and realize strategies so that if this were to happen to any of us and no one was there, how we would deal with it. And trust. Your organization, the core, has to trust each other. If you guys don't trust each other, you're going to crumble because people are going to discredit you. They're going to make up rumors. Wanda was basically not from Charles City and she was the enemy. I was a mole for the Tea Party. I'm not even Republican. So I was a part of the Tea Party. So Cynthia was just known as someone randomly in the community, did everything they could to discredit us. Disagreements are good. It's good to argue. If you trust each other, you know it's not from any ill intent. So if you're disagreeing, that means you guys are really fighting for your for what you need. And also, I have to say this one thing: money is important. Money, we don't get paid. Nobody on this call gets paid from C5. I want everybody to understand that. I know my time is up, but make sure your community knows that you're not getting paid. And pray, meditate, implement, and repeat. That's what I got.
And Louise, that was awesome. And
Beth, make sure you put in there that we don't get paid.
will do. So Lavisha's really speaking as one of the she's a co-director of C5. I can speak a little bit to the lessons that the Richmond Mothers Out Front team learned supporting C5. And one thing I would really emphasize to start is it was really important for our Richmond team to follow the lead of community leaders. So for example, the Cedar Grove Baptist Church, like Lavisha is the clerk of that church, Pastor Henley, the senior pastor of Cedar Grove, they already are leaders in Charles City County that have credibility and connections in the community. So our role was to come in and support, not to come in and try and lead. And also I think it's important to think about, like, it wasn't appropriate for Mothers Out Front to come in and try and recruit people into our organization, but instead to support an organization that was developing in this community. So to support C5 rather than seeing this as like a recruiting opportunity. Also, Lavisha had already said, climate change can't be the singular focus. This was really important because in Charles City County, we could never divorce the issue of these gas plants from economic development questions. So for Mothers Out Front members, we might just be thinking about like, carbon emissions, we've got to stop the gas plants, but it's not that simple in Charles City County. So we can't make climate change the singular focus. We also have to, of course, be aware of barriers to participation in the community. It's important when you're organizing to be really thinking about what, like, location, logistics, and other factors that might be barriers. And also just to be aware of limitations in terms of time, childcare, transportation, cell coverage, those kinds of things. And also residents of Charles City County, but also other communities have a lot on the line. They are speaking out against something that some of their community members have supported. And so they have to, worry about the attacks that Lavisha was referring to, being characterized as Tea Party members when, all they're doing is questioning the validity of this gas plant. And finally, I would just say, of course, be welcoming and be respectful. And just to wrap up, I would really say it's important to think about how much face time matters. Spending time listening and learning from the community that you're working to support. I know FaceTime is a lot more complicated during COVID, but if you really want to build an organization that is inclusive and powerful, it's important to be willing to spend time learning and listening to the community that you hope to work with. That's really basically going to take a lot of time standing around in church parking lots or spending countless hours on Zoom calls. And I know that C5 has devoted endless amounts of time to this work. So I'm so grateful to be in community with them on that. Next slide, please. So please, if you could, follow C5, lift up their cause. I hope that I put the, oh yay, Jessica put all of these links in the chat. Thank you so much. So if you could follow us on Facebook, follow our Twitter page, or Twitter feed or whatever that is. You could share our website out. And of course, most importantly, there are lots of efforts to try to pass legislation that would stop environmental injustices and make environmental justice a bigger part of permitting processes. So in your communities, in federal legislation as well, please just push for laws that address this issue head on. Next slide, please. So I want to welcome the group to have some conversation about this, and feel free to do this in the chat or to unmute. We are interested in hearing from you guys about what you learned about organizing across race and class by listening to the story of C5, and also what you've learned about base building. So if folks want to either throw their observations or learnings in the chat or unmute yourselves. I think you can unmute yourselves and share. Yeah, and I'm seeing very altruistic role. Yeah. Do you want to speak to that?
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for taking the time. And I want to say thank you to all of you, because I mean, doing something not being paid and just by the heart is something that it is amazing. It's beautiful. So I want to say thank you for that.
That's awesome. Yay. And I'm seeing other comments in the chat. If anyone else wants to chime in.
So now that we're back together, we have a little bit of time to share back from the groups. You know, not all of the groups. I don't think we're gonna have time. We have, I believe, 10 minutes right now, but who would like to just speak up and share maybe some of the things you were talking about in your group? Jump in, time is of the essence.
One thing we talked about were house parties, where people from different minorities might not feel comfortable coming into the neighborhood where we live because of the differences. They might feel awkward, feel like an outsider, feel like someone's going to tell them to, what are you doing here? And so that might be a limitation in terms of having house parties, and maybe it would be better to have it at a more public place where, you know, like in a downtown area where everyone feels comfortable going.
I mean, Sheila, we discussed, again, the pandemic and its impact on meeting outside, trying to get more representatives from various different communities to join in, and also just base building on what you know, talking to other communities and finding out what they need and what we're working on, and forming those relationships one-on-one rather than on Zoom.
Although Zoom, if people have access to the technology, it does break down a lot of barriers in terms of having to show up at someone's house, or, you know, it's a riskier thing to go off to someone's house, or so it's a good and a bad, both. Yeah.
Well, Zoom conferences also make it easy for parents to participate when they have kids at home that they can't leave, or kids who may need to be put down to bed and they're gone for like 5 minutes to do that and then they're back. It gives a lot more flexibility staying in your home and participating.
Let's hear from maybe one or two more groups. What did you talk about in your group?
In our conversation, we talked a lot about the dangers of making assumptions about the people that you're working with. And sadly, Rosemary was about to say something really great, or she was already saying something really great. So I want to turn it over to her. if she doesn't mind being put on the spot that way.
Thanks. I think I can continue. It was going to be such a fabulous discussion if we had like 1 hour. But even in these minutes, Margaret knows what I'm saying. Beth and Barb know what I'm saying. I was just bringing up the point about language and the words that we use. Even I think I just heard someone use the word minority, which I suggested to my own elected state legislator today, who is an African-American man, that he should not include that word because we can call people who they are. If we're talking about people who are Black and Latino, let's call them that. So calling people minorities or making assumptions about whether or not people can get to certain places, I think sometimes do us a disservice. So how we think about people is where it begins. So we can practice that in our own private lives through our reading and through what resonates with us. And we can get ready. We can do some homework before we go out to talk to people. So we don't have to ask them questions that may end up giving us answers that don't get us to our goal. We already know that some of these words, some of these ideas don't move us to organizing nor mobilization. They don't do either a King nor a Malcolm, but they leave us, I really loved it, Troya, but they leave us without a connection to people. So just to say it more succinctly, thinking about language and delving into who we are and what we need to know before we go out to spread this information to people can make our work and our passionate work a lot less effort and more fruitful. Yeah.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you.
I just want to chime in real quick about what we discussed in our group really quick that I wanted to point out. One of the things that we talked about was how important I think people don't recognize when the question was, how did we get the people to earn their trust? It was actually being physically there and having physical items, tangible things like our newsletter and us and Wanda and Cynthia talking to people got us 10 times more credibility than a social media post. Like, to all the people here who love Twitter or Facebook, I love y'all and I thank y'all for that because I hate it. I absolutely despise it, but it reaches those that it's supposed to. But I can tell you the credibility we got is from Cynthia talking to people face to face. Like people, what did Maya Angelou said? People remember how you made them feel. If Cynthia goes to the community and tells them that the rain is yellow, they're going to be like, oh, really? Can you explain? Because she actually allowed them to talk to her and get angry and yell. And that's her strength. She can take it and she can relate to them. So the tangible and being physically present will get you a lot more in our experience and see Robinson than actual, with social media. Yeah.
Thank you everyone so much for sharing, your thoughts and your feedback and what you discussed in your group. We'll move on to the next part. I know it's late. We're going to wrap up here now. If Margaret, you could share the screen again, I would appreciate it. All right, so what's next? We've had this amazing presentation from C5. If you want to unmute and give them another round of applause, feel free.
Woo! 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 Yay!
And all of the training.
Woo! Oh.
And so, but where do we go from here, right? We're going to turn off our computer, go to sleep, and we want to start to take action in changing how we organize in a way that is more not transactional, that is transformative. And so it's a cycle. We are suggesting you start with your awareness, like Rosemary was saying, like self-education. We can read things, we can integrate them, we can meditate on them, reflect on them. But then we have to move into action because otherwise we're remaining in, a space that is just our own little bubble. And if you've heard the term white silence is violence, for those of us who have white privilege, like also just remaining in an intellectual space isn't going to change systems either. And so we have to move into capacity building. That's both our own hearts and minds and building up our army of people, that base. And then move out into action, take action. So next slide. Now, we're not saying go ahead and take action like tomorrow, go out and just take the biggest step you can when it comes to figuring out how to organize across race or class, because anti-racism work is like lifting weights. So we're not going to go out tomorrow and lift the 200-pound weight, I hope, because you're going to hurt yourself, but you're also going to hurt other people. You're going to hurt your spotter. You're going to hurt the folks around you. So you want to start by lifting those 5-pound weights, those 10, those 15, and work your way up. It's the same way with dismantling racism and working across race and class. We educate ourselves, we self-reflect, and then take a small action, something that if you totally mess it up, and we all will, you're not going to hurt people too badly, so that you can learn from it, self-reflect, go back to that self-education, and then go out again and take action and go through that cycle over and over again as you build up that muscle of doing good anti-racist organizing across race and class to dismantle white supremacy, to dismantle systemic racism, and to become more transformative in the way that we organize. So we do have readings and other options for continuing to do that self-reflection and that self-learning that we'll be sending out in an email following up this group. Next slide. So we're going to wrap up today. Everyone can go to bed. Thank you for your attendance. In the chat, you're going to see that we have a feedback form that we'd really, really appreciate you take a minute to fill out to give us some feedback on today. And then also in the chat, if you're not a member or you want to donate to Mothers Out Front, that will be dropped into the chat. And so I believe that's it. We have one more slide just to remind you this is a series. So we'll have the Planting a Lot of Seeds on Thursday, August 19th. That's this Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And that's where we'll be talking about all of the different ways, or not all, but some of the different ways to go out and do your base building and speak to as many people in the community as possible, canvassing, tabling, reaching out to centers of community and social media. So hope to see you on Thursday evening, and thank you everyone for being here tonight.